A chance encounter. The city never truly slept, but at this hour, it had begun to wind down. The once bustling streets were now quieter, the neon lights flickering over near-empty sidewalks. Joshua Carter loosened his tie as he stepped out of his high-rise office, his mind heavy with thoughts. At 40, he had everything most people dreamed of, an empire worth billions, a name that commanded respect, and a lifestyle of luxury. Yet, standing at the pinnacle of success, he felt nothing. The late nights, the endless board meetings, the stock market wins, they had all turned into a blur. His fortune had been built on sacrifices, but he never allowed himself to think too deeply about what, or who, he had left behind. He walked down the familiar path toward his waiting car, but something caught his eye near the dimly lit corner of the street. A girl. She was small, barely more than skin and bones, huddled on the cold pavement. A battered hoodie hung off her frame, the sleeves too long, as if they belonged to someone else. She had no shoes, only socks that were torn at the toes. A frayed backpack sat beside her, the fabric so worn it was a wonder it still held together. Joshua wasn't the kind of man to stop for people like her. It wasn't that he was cruel, he simply believed in self-reliance. He had clawed his way up from nothing, and in his mind, success was a choice. But something about this girl made him pause. Maybe it was the way she stared into the distance, unblinking, as if she had long since given up hope. Or maybe it was the way she clutched the tiny cardboard sign in her lap, her fingers trembling. Hungry. Anything helps. Joshua sighed, shaking his head at himself. Keep walking, his mind told him. But his feet didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer. How long have you been out here? His voice, usually strong and commanding, came out softer than he intended. The girl didn't answer right away. She slowly turned her head, and when their eyes met, Joshua felt something strange, like a memory trying to surface. I don't know, she finally murmured. Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Joshua exhaled, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. This wasn't his problem. He could toss a few $100s at her and walk away, just as he had done 100 times before when faced with the uncomfortable sight of the homeless. But then she shivered. A deep, involuntary tremble that shook her entire body. It was freezing outside. Without thinking, he shrugged off his designer coat and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched. It's fine, she said quickly, starting to push it away. Keep it, Joshua insisted. It's just a coat. The girl hesitated, then pulled it tighter around herself, as if afraid he might change his mind. You have a name? He asked. She looked at him warily, as if debating whether to answer. Emma. Something about the name stirred something deep within him. Where are your parents, Emma? She lowered her gaze. My mom, she's gone. And your dad? She hesitated. Never met him. Joshua felt a strange pang in his chest. Where are you staying? He pressed. Emma let out a small, bitter laugh. You're looking at it. Joshua clenched his jaw. This was wrong. A girl this young shouldn't be out here, alone, starving. A car honked in the distance, breaking the silence. He glanced toward his sleek black Mercedes parked nearby. The driver was waiting. He could leave right now. But he knew he wouldn't. For reasons he couldn't explain, he made a decision that went against everything he believed in. Come with me, he said. I'll get you something warm to eat and a safe place for the night. Emma tensed. I don't need charity. Joshua let out a short, humorless laugh. It's not charity. Consider it a business deal. You take the food, and I get to sleep tonight without feeling like a complete asshole for walking away. Emma eyed him cautiously. And then what? You dump me back on the street in the morning? Joshua didn't have an answer to that. Let's start with dinner, he said. Then we'll figure it out. She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Inside the penthouse. The car ride was silent. Emma sat stiffly, clutching her backpack as if she expected him to throw her out at any moment. Joshua didn't press her for conversation. When they arrived at his penthouse, she hesitated at the door. Go ahead, he said. It's warmer inside. Emma stepped in cautiously, her eyes widening at the sheer size of the place. The open floor plan, the marble floors, the grand chandelier, it was a world away from the cold streets she had come from. Joshua walked toward the kitchen. Are you allergic to anything? Emma blinked. What? Food allergies. Do you have any? She shook her head. Good, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Sit tight. Emma watched, clearly skeptical, as he moved around the kitchen. Within minutes, the smell of warm soup filled the air. Here, he said, placing a steaming bowl in front of her. Eat. She stared at the food for a moment before picking up the spoon and taking a cautious sip. Her eyes fluttered closed as she swallowed. Joshua leaned against the counter, watching her. You always cook for your guests, she asked between bites. Not usually, he admitted. But I figured you'd trust the food more if you saw me make it myself. Emma smirked slightly. Smart move. For a brief moment, they shared something that almost resembled normalcy. Then, as Emma reached for the glass of water, something slipped from her hoodie, a small, tarnished locket. It swung slightly, catching the light. Joshua's breath caught in his throat. He knew that locket. 15 years ago, he had given an identical one to someone he had once loved more than anything. Natalie Parker. His first love. The woman he had left behind. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Where did you get that? His voice was hoarse. Emma's fingers instinctively curled around the locket. It was my mom's, she said. She never took it off. Joshua's pulse pounded in his ears. Your mother's name? He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. Emma met his gaze. Natalie Parker. Joshua felt his entire world tilt. The girl sitting in front of him, the one he had pulled off the street just hours ago, wasn't just some stranger. She was his daughter. The locket of memories. Joshua Carter felt the ground shift beneath him. The air in the penthouse, once filled with the comforting scent of warm soup, now felt suffocating. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stared at the locket around Emma's neck. 15 years. That's how long it had been since he had last seen that locket, since he had last seen her. Natalie Parker. His first love. His past. The only woman who had ever made him question his relentless pursuit of success. Joshua had given Natalie that locket when they were young and full of dreams. He remembered the moment vividly, standing under the old oak tree behind her grandmother's house, the summer air thick with the scent of wildflowers. She had laughed, calling him a fool for spending money on something so small, but her eyes had sparkled when she put it on. And now, it was here. Hanging around the neck of a girl he had just taken off the streets. A girl with Natalie's eyes. A horrifying realization clawed at the edges of his mind. Emma was his daughter. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? His hands trembled as he set his glass down. Your mother, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Natalie Parker. Tell me about her. Emma stiffened. She didn't move for a moment, her fingers clenching around the locket. Then, slowly, she looked up at him. What do you care, she asked, her voice tight. Joshua exhaled. Please. Just tell me. Emma studied him for a moment, something unreadable in her hazel eyes. Then she spoke. She was the best person I ever knew, she said quietly. She worked 2 jobs to keep us fed. She never complained, even when she was tired. Even when she got sick. Joshua's heart clenched. Sick? Emma swallowed hard. She had cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. Emma's voice cracked, but she shook her head, forcing herself to continue. She fought as hard as she could. But we couldn't afford treatment. She died in our apartment last winter. Joshua's stomach twisted. She had died alone. Struggling. And he had been nowhere. He had spent the last 15 years amassing wealth, sitting in boardrooms, buying companies, expanding his empire. Meanwhile, Natalie, the girl he had once sworn he loved, had been suffering. She never told me, he murmured. His voice sounded distant, hollow. Emma scoffed. Of course she didn't. Joshua flinched at the bitterness in her tone. She never wanted to ask for anything, Emma continued. Even when she was at her worst, she refused to beg. She said we didn't need anyone. That we'd be fine on our own. The weight of those words crushed him. Did she ever mention me? He asked hesitantly. Emma's gaze hardened. Not at first. I didn't even know your name until I was 10. When I asked about my father, she just said, he's gone. Like you were dead or something. Joshua felt like he had been punched. I didn't know, he whispered. Emma gave him a look so sharp it could cut glass. And that makes it okay? Joshua didn't have an answer. A past he couldn't escape. Joshua stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city. The lights twinkled below, his empire stretching as far as the eye could see. For years, he had told himself that his sacrifices were justified. That leaving Natalie was necessary. That love was a distraction, and success required undivided focus. He had told himself that she had moved on. That she was happy. But now, he knew the truth. Natalie had spent her final years struggling. She had died poor, fighting for every breath. And Emma, his own daughter, had been left to fend for herself. How many times had he walked past beggars on the street, never sparing them a second glance? And all this time, his own child had been one of them? Guilt sank into his bones like lead. He turned back to Emma, who was gripping her locket as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. You hate me, he said quietly. Emma didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was cold. I don't know you enough to hate you. Those words hurt more than he expected. Joshua swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand, I never knew. If I had. Emma shot up from her seat. Would you have done anything? Joshua froze. She stepped forward, her small frame trembling. Would you have really come back? Or would you have still chosen your money, your business, your perfect little life? Joshua wanted to say yes. He wanted to say he would have dropped everything, that he would have been there. But would he? 15 years ago, he had been a different man. A man who believed success was the only thing that mattered. And that man would have walked away. His silence was enough of an answer. Emma laughed bitterly. That's what I thought. She turned away, grabbing her backpack. Thanks for the food. I'll go now. Panic surged in Joshua's chest. No. Emma stopped but didn't turn around. You don't have to go, Joshua said. You can stay here. Emma let out a dry laugh. And then what? You play dad for a few weeks, realize I don't fit into your perfect world, and send me back to the streets? Joshua stepped forward. Emma, I don't, she cut him off. I don't need your pity. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'll be fine. She started toward the door. Joshua felt a deep, raw fear clawing at him. She was leaving. And if she walked out now, he knew he would never see her again. He had lost Natalie. He couldn't lose Emma too. Wait, he said desperately. If not for me, then at least let me help you. A place to stay. Food. School. Whatever you need. Emma paused at the door. He held his breath. She didn't turn around. But after a long, tense moment, she sighed. 1 week, she muttered. Joshua's heart pounded. 1 week? That's all you get, she said. After that, I'm gone. It wasn't much. But it was something. Joshua exhaled, nodding. Okay, he said. 1 week. As Emma walked past him toward the guest room, Joshua felt the weight of his past crashing down on him. 1 week. 1 week to prove he could be a father. 1 week to fix the damage he had done. 1 week, to make her stay. A broken past, a fragile present. The penthouse was eerily quiet after Emma disappeared into the guest room. Joshua Carter stood frozen in his own home, feeling like a stranger. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, his past, his mistakes, his daughter. His daughter. The words still didn't feel real. 15 years. That's how long it had been since he last saw Natalie, since he had walked away from the love they had shared, thinking it was the right thing to do. He had convinced himself that cutting ties was necessary. That she would move on. That he would, too. But he had never moved on. And now, standing in his cold, sterile penthouse, he realized something terrifying. He had a second chance. A chance to fix what he had broken. But did she even want him to? Memories he couldn't escape. Sleep was impossible that night. Joshua lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything Emma had said. The pain in her voice. The anger. The disappointment. She never told me. She never asked for help. But why would she? He had been the one to leave. The one who had chosen ambition over love. Over family. Memories of Natalie flooded his mind. He remembered the night they had fought, the last night he had seen her. She had cried, begging him to reconsider, to see that success didn't have to come at the cost of their love. But he had been too stubborn, too blinded by his own ambition to listen. I won't wait forever, Josh, she had whispered through tears. One day, you're going to realize that all this money, all this success, it won't mean anything if you have no one to share it with. He had ignored her words back then. Now, they haunted him. Because she had been right. The morning after. The next morning, Joshua found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee machine like it held all the answers. His thoughts were a mess. How was he supposed to fix this? How could he expect Emma to trust him when he had done nothing to earn it? The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Emma entered the kitchen, her expression unreadable. She looked hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she was welcome. Joshua quickly straightened. Morning. Emma gave a small nod. Morning. An awkward silence stretched between them. Joshua cleared his throat. I made breakfast. Emma's eyes flicked toward the food on the counter, eggs, toast, bacon, and fresh fruit. It was a far cry from the scraps she was used to eating. She hesitated. Go ahead, Joshua said. Eat as much as you want. Emma sat down cautiously, eyeing him like she was waiting for a catch. The silence between them was thick, but Joshua knew he had to say something. You, sleep okay? Emma shrugged. The bed was nice. Joshua nodded. Good. More silence. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated at how hard this was. He was used to negotiating billion-dollar deals, handling press conferences, making split-second decisions. But sitting across from his own daughter? He felt completely out of his depth. Emma, however, seemed perfectly fine with the silence. She focused on her food, eating carefully, as if she was afraid it would disappear if she didn't savor every bite. It broke his heart. How long had she gone without a decent meal? How many nights had she spent hungry, cold, scared? He had to do something. Emma, he started cautiously. What do you want to do after this? She glanced up, confused. After what? Joshua shifted in his seat. After this week. You said you'd stay for 7 days. And after that? Emma went quiet. Then, without looking at him, she said, I'll figure it out. Joshua frowned. Emma, you don't have to go back out there. Emma's fork paused mid-air. You don't owe me anything, she said, her voice firm. Joshua sighed. I know. But I want to help. Emma gave him a long, searching look. Why now? Joshua hesitated. Because I failed you once, he admitted. I don't want to fail you again. Emma scoffed. A little late for that, don't you think? Joshua clenched his jaw. Maybe. But I still want to try. Emma shook her head. You don't even know me. Then let me. Emma's expression flickered with something, hesitation, vulnerability, but she quickly masked it. 1 week, she reminded him. Joshua nodded. 1 week. But in his heart, he knew, 1 week would never be enough. He wasn't going to let her walk away. Not again. A past she kept hidden. Later that day, Joshua had to step out for a meeting. Before leaving, he hesitated at the doorway of Emma's room. She was sitting on the bed, flipping through an old, tattered notebook. Emma, he called gently. She looked up. I have a few things to take care of. But if you need anything, the staff can help you. Emma shrugged. Okay. Joshua hesitated. He wanted to say more, but he didn't know how. So he just nodded and left. Once he was gone, Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. It was old, the pages yellowed, the corners bent. Inside were scribbled notes, little doodles, and messy handwriting, her mother's handwriting. She ran her fingers over the faded ink. One day, you're going to find him, Em. And when you do, you'll know if he deserves you. Emma swallowed hard. She had never believed in fairy tale reunions. She had spent years resenting the man who had left her mother alone, the man who had unknowingly left her to suffer. But now that she was here, she didn't know how to feel. Joshua Carter wasn't what she expected. He was powerful, intimidating, rich. He lived in a world that was nothing like hers. But he also looked at her like he wanted to fix everything. Like he regretted the past. Emma didn't know if she could believe him. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to try. Bridges made of glass. Joshua Carter had faced some of the most ruthless business moguls in the world. He had built an empire from the ground up, crushed competitors, and turned struggling companies into gold. And yet, nothing had prepared him for this. Navigating a conversation with his own daughter, a daughter he never knew existed, felt more impossible than any corporate deal he had ever brokered. Emma was a puzzle with missing pieces, a locked door with no key. She had agreed to stay for a week, but Joshua knew she was counting down the days. Every interaction, every glance, every conversation was layered with unspoken resentment, guarded emotions, and quiet defiance. Joshua had expected anger. What he hadn't expected was the ache that came with knowing how much he had missed. A failed attempt at fatherhood. Joshua spent the morning trying to work, but his mind kept drifting back to Emma. Finally, Unable to focus, he gave up. He found her in the living room, curled up on the couch, flipping through TV channels with disinterest. "Emma," he said cautiously. She barely glanced at him. "Yeah?" He cleared his throat. "I was thinking, we should do something together. You know, get out of the apartment for a bit." Emma arched an eyebrow. "Like what? A father-daughter picnic?" Her sarcasm stung, but he refused to back down. "How about shopping?" he suggested. "I noticed you don't have many clothes with you. We can pick out whatever you like." Emma stiffened. Joshua realized he had made a mistake the second the words left his mouth. She set the remote down and turned to face him fully. "Let me guess," she said coolly. "You think you can fix everything with money?" Joshua sighed. "That's not what I meant. Isn't it?" Emma crossed her arms. "You see a problem, you throw money at it. That's what rich people do, right?" His jaw tightened. "Emma, I just want to make things easier for you." She scoffed. "I've been getting by just fine without your money." Joshua exhaled slowly. "I know you have. But you don't have to struggle anymore." Emma shook her head, grabbing her hoodie from the couch. "I don't want your pity, Joshua." He flinched. She had called him by his name. Not Dad. Not even Mr. Carter. Just Joshua. It was a small thing, but it made his chest ache. Emma pulled on her hoodie. "I'm going out." Joshua straightened. "Where?" She narrowed her eyes. "Why? Are you going to put a tracking chip on me?" "Emma." "Relax," she interrupted. "I just need some air." She didn't wait for his response before walking out the door. Joshua stood there, staring after her, feeling more lost than he had in years. Lost and found. Emma walked aimlessly through the city streets, hands stuffed in her hoodie pockets. She had no destination in mind, just the need to get away. Being in Joshua's penthouse was suffocating. It wasn't the luxury. It wasn't the space. It was him. The way he looked at her, like he wanted to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Like he actually cared. She didn't know how to deal with that. She had spent years building walls, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. She had survived on her own. She had been the one to comfort her mother when the pain got unbearable. She had been the one to scrape together whatever food she could find when money ran out. She had been the one sleeping in abandoned buildings when there was nowhere else to go. She had learned not to trust people. So why was Joshua making it so damn hard to keep her distance? Lost in thought, she didn't realize where her feet had taken her until she looked up. Her stomach dropped. She was standing in front of a small, run-down apartment building. The paint was peeling, the windows cracked, the metal railing rusted. Her old home. The place where she had watched her mother fade away, where she had spent nights shivering under a thin blanket, where she had learned how cruel life could be. She swallowed hard. It wasn't home anymore. It never had been. But she couldn't stop herself from climbing the steps. Unfinished goodbyes. The apartment door was locked. Of course, it was. The landlord had kicked her out a month after her mother died. She had begged for more time, but he hadn't cared. She clenched her fists. Taking a deep breath, she sat down on the cold, concrete steps. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her mother's old notebook. Flipping through the pages, she found the one she had read 1,000 times before. A note her mother had written but never sent. "Joshua. I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. I never regretted loving you. Even when things got hard. Even when you left. Emma is amazing. She's smart, stubborn, I wonder where she gets that from, and stronger than I ever was. I wish you could have met her. I wish she could have met you. But I won't ask for your help. That's not who I am. That's not who we are. Take care of yourself, Josh. I hope your success was worth it. Natalie. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. Her mother had never hated him. Even after everything. So why did she? Or maybe, she didn't. Maybe she was just scared to believe that Joshua actually cared. A father's desperation. Meanwhile, Joshua was losing his mind. Emma had been gone for hours. He had given her space at first, but as time passed and she didn't return, anxiety clawed at his chest. He had already lost one person he loved. He couldn't lose another. Finally, after debating for too long, he grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. His first stop was the security office in his building. "Did you see where she went?" he asked the guard. The man nodded. She headed east, toward the lower district. Joshua's gut twisted. The lower district wasn't safe. Heart pounding, he ran to his car and drove, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. By the time he reached the lower district, it was dark. He searched the streets, panic growing with every second. Then, finally, he saw her. Sitting on the steps of an old, crumbling apartment building, looking so small and lost. His chest tightened. He parked the car and approached slowly. "Emma?" She looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to come. Joshua sat down next to her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Joshua broke the silence. "Your mother lived here?" Emma nodded. Until she couldn't anymore. Joshua ran a hand down his face. "I should have been here." Emma exhaled shakily. "Yeah. You should have." More silence. Then, quietly, Emma whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you." Joshua swallowed hard. "I know." Emma bit her lip. "But I don't know if I want to leave, either." Hope flickered in his chest. Joshua turned to her. "Then don't." Emma hesitated. And for the first time, he saw it. A crack in her walls. A chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. Shadows of the past, light of the future. Joshua Carter was a man who had built walls around himself, walls of power, success, and cold efficiency. But tonight, as he sat beside his daughter on the crumbling steps of her past, those walls felt fragile, as if they could collapse with just a single word from her. Emma wasn't just a reminder of what he had lost, she was a reminder of everything he had missed. And if he was going to have a second chance, he couldn't afford to waste it. An uneasy truce. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Joshua exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You know, I spent my entire life thinking I had everything under control." Emma glanced at him. "And now?" His lips quirked into a humorless smile. "Now I realize I was an idiot." She huffed a quiet laugh. "Well, at least you admit it." A beat of silence. Then, Emma shifted slightly. I don't know what you expect from me, Joshua." Joshua flinched at the name, but he didn't correct her. He had no right to. "I don't expect anything," he said honestly. "I just want a chance." Emma studied him carefully. A chance for what? He looked at her, really looked at her. The way her mother's eyes shone in her face. The way her stubbornness mirrored his own. A chance to be your father. Emma tensed, her fingers gripping the edges of her hoodie sleeves. "I don't know if I can do that." Joshua nodded, accepting her words, even as they cut him deeply. "Then let's start with something easier." Emma eyed him warily. "Like what?" He hesitated, then asked the one question that had been haunting him for days. "Tell me about her." Emma blinked. "Who?" Joshua swallowed. "Your mother." Emma stiffened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she exhaled. "She was strong," Emma said quietly. "Even when she was sick, even when we had nothing, she never let me see how scared she was." Joshua listened intently, every word carving into his soul. "She used to sing to me at night," Emma continued, her voice softer now. "Even when we didn't have enough to eat, even when she was in pain, she made sure I felt safe." Joshua clenched his jaw. He had failed them both. "She never talked about you," Emma admitted. "Not really. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd take out an old photograph." Joshua inhaled sharply. "She never hated you," Emma said, almost accusingly. "Even after everything, she still." Her voice broke. Joshua's chest ached. "Emma, I don't want your apologies," she interrupted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know how to do this, okay?" Joshua nodded, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "Neither do I." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she whispered, "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was something. And Joshua would take it. The ghosts that linger. That night, Emma agreed to come back to the penthouse. She didn't speak much during the ride back, and Joshua didn't push. But when they stepped inside, a familiar voice rang through the apartment. "Mr. Carter." "I was just about to." Margaret, Joshua's longtime housekeeper, froze mid-sentence. Her eyes widened as she took in Emma's face. Then, to Joshua's complete shock, she gasped and covered her mouth. Emma frowned. Do I know you?" Margaret's hands trembled as she slowly lowered them. "My God," she whispered. "You look just like her." Emma's breath hitched. Joshua tensed. "Margaret, you." "I knew your mother," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. Emma's eyes widened. "What?" Margaret turned to Joshua, tears in her eyes. "She used to come here." Joshua froze. Emma's voice wavered. "What do you mean, here?" Margaret swallowed hard. 15 years ago, before she disappeared, she came to see him. She nodded toward Joshua. Emma turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You told me you never saw her again." Joshua's stomach dropped. Margaret hesitated. "He didn't. Because he wasn't home." Emma's heart pounded. "She came here?" Margaret nodded. "She was pregnant. She begged me to let her wait, to see him. But he was in London for a business deal, and she couldn't stay." Joshua's hands clenched into fists. He had been so close. Emma's lips trembled. "She was here, and you didn't even know?" Joshua felt sick. "I didn't." Margaret wiped her eyes. "She left me a letter to give to you." Joshua's breath caught. Margaret turned, rummaged through an old wooden box near the fireplace, and pulled out a faded envelope. She handed it to him with shaking hands. Joshua stared at the envelope as if it might burn him. His name was written on it in Natalie's handwriting. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The letter that changed everything. "Joshua. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I came here today, hoping to see you. Hoping to tell you that I never stopped loving you. But maybe it's better this way. You have a life now. A future. And I won't ruin it for you. Our time was short, but it was real. And it gave me the greatest gift I could have ever asked for. Her name is Emma. She's strong and stubborn, just like you. And she deserves better than a life of what-ifs. So I won't ask you to find us. I won't ask you to change your life. I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. Natalie. Joshua closed his eyes, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. Emma stood frozen, her entire world tilting on its axis. She came for you, Emma whispered, her voice thick with pain. She came for you, and you weren't here. Joshua looked up, his eyes filled with raw agony. Emma, I swear, would have come. I never stopped loving her. Emma's breath hitched. And what about me? Joshua reached for her, but she stepped back. The air between them was thick with pain, with missed chances, with years they would never get back. Emma clenched her fists. I need to think. Joshua nodded, though the thought of her leaving again terrified him. Take all the time you need. Emma turned and walked toward her room. Joshua stared after her, his entire world crumbling. For years, he had convinced himself that money could fix anything. But this? This was something money couldn't buy. And he had no idea if he would ever earn the one thing he wanted most. Her forgiveness. A father's redemption. Joshua Carter had faced countless challenges in his life, business rivalries, hostile takeovers, financial crises, but nothing had prepared him for this. The hardest battle he had ever fought was not in boardrooms or negotiations. It was here. Right in his own home. Fighting for a daughter he had never known. And for the first time in his life, money, power, and status meant nothing. A deafening silence. The next morning, Joshua found himself staring at the door to Emma's room. It had been closed all night. He hadn't slept. Not really. Instead, he had sat in his office, reading and rereading Natalie's letter until the words blurred. She had come for him. She had needed him. And he hadn't been there. Now, Emma, his daughter, his flesh and blood, was slipping away, just like her mother had. He couldn't let that happen. A simple breakfast, a heavy atmosphere. By the time Margaret set the breakfast table, Joshua was already seated, his hands clasped together. Emma finally emerged, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. She hesitated for a second before sitting down across from him. Margaret placed a plate in front of her. Eat, child. You barely touched dinner last night. Emma nodded quietly, but she didn't reach for the food. Joshua cleared his throat. I know you have every reason to hate me. Emma stiffened. He exhaled. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. She finally looked up, her eyes unreadable. Then why are you trying so hard? Joshua hesitated. Because I've lost enough. Emma studied him for a long moment. You don't even know me. No, Joshua admitted. But I want to. Emma let out a humorless laugh. That's not how this works. You don't just get to decide to be my father overnight. Joshua swallowed the lump in his throat. I know. Emma pushed her food around with her fork. I don't know if I want this. A sharp pain shot through his chest, but he nodded. That's your choice. But I'll be here. No matter what. Emma was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, she whispered, why didn't you ever look for her? Joshua flinched. He had asked himself the same question 100 times since last night. He could have found them. He should have found them. I thought she had moved on, he admitted. That she didn't want me in her life anymore. Emma's voice was bitter. So you just gave up? Joshua clenched his jaw. I made the wrong choice. And I've regretted it every single day since I found out the truth. Emma exhaled shakily, then finally took a bite of her food. It wasn't much. But it was something. A step toward healing. Over the next few days, things were complicated. Emma kept her distance, but she didn't leave. And Joshua gave her space, even though it killed him to do so. He wanted to make up for lost time, but he knew he couldn't rush it. So he started small. One morning, he left a book outside her door, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of Natalie's favorites. She didn't say anything about it, but later that night, he noticed the book was gone. The next day, he made her a playlist of old songs he and Natalie used to love. Emma rolled her eyes but didn't reject it. And then, one evening, she hesitantly approached him. "I need a job," she said. Joshua blinked. "A job?" Emma nodded. "I don't want to be here just because you feel guilty. I want to stand on my own feet." Joshua frowned. "Emma, you don't have to." "I want to," she insisted. Joshua studied her face. She was serious. And suddenly, he saw so much of Natalie in her, the same pride, the same fierce independence. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll help you." Emma crossed her arms. "No handouts." Joshua smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." And for the first time since she had come into his life, Emma smiled. Just a little. But it was enough. The first test. Joshua arranged an interview for Emma at one of his company's charity foundations. It was an entry-level position, nothing glamorous, but it was something to give her experience. He knew she was nervous, even though she tried to hide it. The day of the interview, she hesitated before stepping into the office. Joshua placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You got this." Emma took a deep breath. "We'll see." She disappeared inside, and Joshua waited outside, pacing. Half an hour later, she walked out with an unreadable expression. "Well?" he asked. She stared at him for a moment, then sighed. "They hired me." Joshua grinned. "Of course they did." Emma rolled her eyes. "Don't act so smug." But there was something lighter in her tone. And for the first time, Joshua dared to hope. An unexpected reunion. A week later, as Joshua was leaving his office, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Well, well. Joshua Carter." He turned around and froze. Standing in front of him was Ethan Blackwood. Natalie's brother. Emma's uncle. Ethan's eyes were cold. "We need to talk." Joshua clenched his jaw. "I suppose we do." They stepped into his office, and the moment the door closed, Ethan's face darkened. "Where the hell were you?" he demanded. Joshua exhaled. "I didn't know." Ethan scoffed. "Bullshit." Joshua ran a hand through his hair. "I swear to you, Ethan, if I had known." Ethan cut him off. "Natalie died alone." "She struggled, Joshua. She had no one." His voice cracked. "And you were out there living in luxury, thinking she had just moved on?" Guilt slammed into Joshua like a freight train. "I loved her," he said hoarsely. Ethan shook his head. "Then why weren't you there?" Joshua had no answer. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Emma doesn't need more pain, Joshua. If you're not serious about this, walk away now." Joshua met his gaze, his voice firm. "I'm not walking away." Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good." And with that, he walked out. Joshua exhaled. Another battle won. But the war was far from over. A future worth fighting for. That night, Emma found Joshua sitting by the fireplace, staring at Natalie's old letter. She hesitated. "You okay?" Joshua looked up. He managed a small smile. "I will be." Emma sat down beside him. For a moment, they just sat there in silence. Then, slowly, Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. Joshua froze. Then, hesitantly, he wrapped an arm around her. It was tentative. Awkward. But it was real. A new beginning. And for the first time in his life, Joshua realized. This was worth more than any fortune he could ever build. Because this was family. And he wasn't going to lose it again.